So let's talk about starting a Leagues of Votann army with the launch box as a starting point. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're returning to the Space Dwarves once more. This time I thought it would be interesting to talk about starting the faction from a standing start. Perhaps you've got the launch box, and then we'll talk about which ways that you could go from there. The Leagues of Votann release does seem to be a pretty popular one. A whole new faction to 40k doesn't happen very often. And although the army's aesthetic isn't for everyone, much like just about every army in 40k to be honest, it does seem that enough people are on board with the idea of some exciting new augmented cloned space dwarves. Of course, a lot of the chatter for people who've been playtesting the codex does seem that they're incredibly strong in game at the moment, and I think if I were collecting them from a standing start, I'd argue that at least some balance changes are probably going to happen to their rules. I would not be at all surprised if Games Workshop does make some alterations to the codex, say maybe either toning down judgment tokens a bit, or perhaps some points increases to a few choice units, say for example the land fortress. Of course that isn't really guaranteed yet, but it does seem that just about every second codex in 9th edition has had some major or minor nerfs after it's come out, and I feel that these guys, with the strength that they are, aren't going to be an exception to that. I'd say at this point it means that there's a bit more of an argument for just buying what you like, picking up the models that look the best or maybe fit whatever lore theme that you're going to. I honestly wouldn't be too put off by the amount of community backlash. A lot of people seem to be taking to the comment section and saying I'm not playing this army, but even in their current form I think lots of armies will do fine against them. Anything that they can't bring their short-ranged heavy firepower to bear on. And I strongly suspect that like the rest of the armies in 40k, Games Workshop will nerf them if they are too strong, and I feel like all the people being annoyed will settle down a bit once they are a bit more in line with the other armies. Regardless, I think plenty of people are going to pick them up either way, and it is kind of an interesting prospect, expanding an entire new 40k army, as basically no one has the full range of models yet, unless they're 3D printing some proxies or something. Obviously at time of recording, quite a lot of the range isn't out yet. Most of the kits are expected to be dropping in mid to late October, though it's not too impossible that things could be delayed a bit more than this if Games Workshop does want to string out the release a little bit. Still though, with typical prices for Games Workshop's boxes, it's not really too hard to predict roughly how much they're going to cost, and you can already do quite a lot of theory crafting and planning now. So starting out then, here we have the Leagues of Votann launch box. This is what a lot of people have picked up already, £120, €155 or $200 direct from Games Workshop. It also seems to be under order from Element Games for £102 here in the UK, and I'll leave a link to that down in the video description. As well as the codex and data cards, you get a fairly decent chunk of core units for the army, 2 heroes, a Carl and an Einherjar champion. You can also field the Carl either as a High Carl or Uthar the Destined, the Great Etherean League character. And the Einherjar champion's a bit of a melee powerhouse. I'd probably go with the big hammer for him personally. The relic one really is quite brutal with those mortal wounds. For the Carl, I think I'd be most tempted to just build the standard model unless you know that you're definitely committing to Great Etherean League. I guess it might not be too hard to perhaps magnetize out the weapon and have a counts as Uthar, if you did want to get something going like that big crazy combo with the railgun and the auto hitting on 6s. Then you've got 20 Hearthkin warriors as well, perhaps around about 280 points once you've included special weapons and upgrades and things, that you could field them quite cheap if you wanted. Armament wise for these, at least at first impression, I think I'd be most tempted to take the bolters just for some cheap shots, and then if you were going to expand out to actually include some fancy kit for them, I'd probably take some Magna Rail rifles for the chance to punch through some invul saves, and I feel like the med pack is pretty much an auto include in just about any unit. That's really good value for the cost and allows a fun stratagem. Quite nice that you get 2 troops choices in the box. That does help establish the core of a force. Then there's a unit of 3 Hernkin Pioneers, maybe around 105 points if you did say take the rotary cannon and the searchlight perhaps. The other upgrades do seem pretty usable though, particularly for big squads. I feel like the bikers are pretty much never going to be a wrong choice in the Votann list. Fast moving obsec with a decent amount of firepower is always going to be great, even if their defense isn't super impressive. Overall, it does seem like a fairly strong start to a Votann army. It basically gets you a patrol detachment with 2 HQs, 2 troops, and 1 fast attack, around about 600 points worth of models depending on what selections you make. The question is though, where to go from there. Just quickly while we're on the subject of the army box though, I thought I'd just quickly mention the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway that's happening at the start of October. This one's going to be 3 copies of that launch box that we've just talked through. They have arrived with me now and they're ready to post out. As normal with these giveaways, there's 2 different ways that you can enter, both are linked down in the video description. You can either support the channel on Patreon for any amount and help keep these videos coming. That gives you automatic entry to the giveaways every month. Or you can enter via social media, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, like the Facebook page, and then to actually enter the draw, the giveaway post appears on the 1st of the month. Reply to that post with a picture of any 40k model or imagery, plus your name and the date handwritten within the photo, and then the entries all on that post get included into the draw as well. The photo bit is just to try and deter Facebook bots and spammers. Then I put all the Patreon and Facebook entries all into a big draw, do it with a random number generator and pick out the winners, and I'll post out one of these launch boxes to the 3 winners wherever you happen to be in the world. There's further similar giveaways every month. I announce the results in a channel update video on the 4th of each month. In any case, feel free to check out the Patreon page or the Facebook page. They're both links down in the video description if you're interested. In any case, getting into expanding the army from this box set, it looks like, at least at the moment, that there's 2 different options for further value bundles that are going to be coming out. The launch box army set will have somewhat limited supply, so once it's gone, but you could potentially bulk out the forces with a second one of these, or maybe wait for the combat patrol box to release, which we already know the contents of. If you bought a second copy of the launch box, then you probably want to sell off the extra codex and the data cards. They're not really things that you're going to get much value out of having 2 of. It does appear that people are doing that quite a lot already, so the codex is going very cheap on eBay right now. If you did just want to read about the faction, it's going to be about as cheap as it ever is at the moment until this bundle goes away. If you did eBay the paper bits, then at the moment you'd have this box set for around about £100 or $170. So in theory around about another 600 points worth of things for that. I think for me the Hearthkin and the Hernkin are both options that you could certainly use in most lists. Anywhere between 1 and 3 units of Hernkin look like they could make themselves into just about every strong Votann list, I feel. And with the Hearthkin, this would allow you to fill out a battalion detachment, and even if you didn't want to field more than 30 Hearthkin warriors, I guess you could partly build up the last squad with a bunch of the other special weapon options. You could potentially use it to swap out different gun choices from game to game. In terms of extra models, I feel like maybe the extra characters are perhaps the most questionable part of the extra value. You certainly could use a Carl and a High Carl within the same detachment for more Judgment Token love, but I feel like they're perhaps going to be competing with the other very good HQs that they have on offer. And perhaps the Iron Hare Champion, I think in particular, might not be one that you necessarily want more than 1 of. They seem very strong for their combat stats, but just maybe it doesn't feel quite as necessary to the army as it doesn't give you other buffs on other units. Again, I guess if you didn't really want the extra heroes, you could potentially eBay them as well, I suppose. Or perhaps just do something like build up the other Iron Hare Champion with the axe rather than the hammer, and give you the option to field a different one if the other one actually made sense. Say for example if you're fielding the Emir League, and you could have those flurry of axe attacks with damage 2 rather than damage 1 maybe. Overall though, it doesn't seem like the worst choice in the world, and it does seem how a fair few people have chosen to start Votann armies by picking up multiple copies of the same big box, and then just selling off the bits that they don't need. Otherwise, the other option that's a potential to wait for is the Combat Patrol box, which should be £90, €120 or $150. Hopefully this will come out when the Codex does. Sometimes Games Workshop have delayed the Combat Patrol releases though till a bit later. The contents of this box were confirmed by a page in the Codex, and it looks like the Combat Patrol box will be the Carl or Uthar, 10 Hearthkin Warriors, 3 Hernkin Pioneers, and then a unit of the 5 Chthonian Berserks, and it does look like that kit gives you the option to build up one of them as that Mole Grenade Launcher unit on the big base with the Ironkin Assistant. Again, it's going to depend on exactly how you load them, but this will get you around about another 450 points worth of models on the table, and maybe has a fair bit of overlap still with the launch box, but maybe not quite to the same extent that just doubling up on the same thing does. I feel like for the Hearthkin and the Hernkin, the extra single unit seems pretty useful to be honest. Lets you fill out a battalion on the troop side neatly, and as I mentioned, the extra unit of bikes are fine. Maybe the extra Carl is a bit underwhelming, but they're hardly going to be the worst choice when they're throwing around judgment tokens. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the box compared with the launch box is that Berserks unit. They do seem like they've got really brutal melee damage, but might just mean that you really want to pick up a transport for them at some stage, maybe a Sagittal, so they actually have a bit more of a good chance of getting those concussion mauls into combat and not just getting shot up with their low armor saves first. I think for the Berserks, I'd be most tempted just to give the entire squad concussion mauls, the great big hammers, and for me the Mole Grenade Launcher just looks a bit underwhelming in terms of what you get for the extra points. In general though, I think if I was trying to get a big force of Leaguers of Votann on the table, I would probably pick up either a second copy of the launch box or the Combat Patrol. Out of the two, probably waiting for the Combat Patrol seems like the better solution. I feel like the force that it gives you will be a bit more well-rounded with a different extra damage dealer unit. Otherwise, now we do know the rest of the Votann range that's going to be coming out, and to be honest with Games Workshop's fairly standardised pricing structure, it's not really going to be too hard to predict at least roughly what they're going to be costing. The numbers here might be a little bit overblown or a little bit too cheap, but I strongly suspect that these estimates are going to be at least fairly close to how much the kits will cost eventually. First up, we've got the other two HQs, the Grimnir and the Brockier Ironmaster. Perhaps not the most essential buys early on, but I feel like if I was getting a Leagues of Votann army together, I would probably want to pick up one copy of both of these at some stage. Both of them just do seem to add an awful lot to the army for the points that they cost. I suspect the Grimnir Psycho with his little Corv bots would be somewhere around the standard character price of £24, €31 or $38. He's an 80-point little unit and gives you a few useful psychic powers, including make a unit more tougher and farming command points every turn, really powerful with the Votann's great stratagems. I feel like he's probably a unit that's kind of safe from any nerfs as well. The command point farming thing doesn't seem overblown compared with other factions. The Brockier Ironmaster I suspect would be a bit more expensive, seeing as he comes with more models in attendance. Perhaps something kind of similar to that Primaris Chaplain on bike miniature, maybe £30, €40 or $50 or thereabouts. I'd field him as the Forge Master upgraded version, and he just brings so much crazy utility to land fortresses that I feel like you could argue that he's the best value Votann miniature for the points in the entire codex at the moment. He makes vehicles shoot better and repairs them, can negate big incoming damage with ease, gets you free CP to spend on war gear stratagems, and then also has that crazy mortal wound damage hose that he can turn on if you spend a few CP on him. Pretty mad stuff, and I think that if Votann players wind up building around land fortresses that much, then this guy's probably going to be in attendance. Otherwise, for more OBSEC units, there's the Hearthkin Warriors and the Hernkin Pioneers. I'd expect these to cost somewhere around £35, €48 or $60, kind of similar to Games Workshop's offerings for things like the Outriders for Space Marines, and perhaps the standard Sisters of Battle Battle Sister Squad, which seems like quite a close analogue for the options that you get in the Hearthkin box. I suspect that getting more of these just individually probably isn't as good an idea as getting them out of the launch box or the Combat Patrol at this point. I feel like they're both units that you could probably look out for online, going cheaper than how much Games Workshop might sell them for. It kind of depends as to which units people find the most value from the box. Kind of interesting that looking on eBay at the moment, the Hearthkin Warriors are going really quite cheap for what Games Workshop would charge for them, around about £26 in the UK, where the Hernkin Pioneers very much are not, probably just because you get only a few of them in the box, and maybe a lot of people might want a decent amount of them for lists. This might stabilise out a bit though once the Combat Patrol box comes out, and once the kits are available individually. I guess whether or not you're wanting more of these depends on how foot or bike heavy you might want to go. I feel like for the Hearthkin Warrior side of things, I suspect that just Mass Dwarf Horde probably isn't going to be the strongest build for the army. I'd be a bit more tempted just to fill up minimum sized troop slots and save more points for the extra cool damage dealers. Certainly does seem like a fairly intimidating prospect though, with that many OBSEC models slogging towards objectives who can hit you back very hard at close range. I suspect that most lists on the other hand will take around about 2 or 3 units of bikes if the fast attack slots allow. Perhaps another pickup of a squad of bikes might not be the worst to add to Combat Patrol boxes or launch boxes. I feel like you could happily expand them to units of 5 and 6 and still be very good. Otherwise, there's 3 different flavours of elite infantry, the Einhir Hearthguard, Chthonian Berserks and Brockier Thunderkin. It looks like you get 5 Hearthguard, 5 Berserks that also builds the Mole Launcher, and 3 Thunderkin in each box, and I honestly feel that these will probably be the similar sort of price to the standard troops boxes. £35, €48 or $60. It's possible that the Thunderkin might be very slightly less as to just being 3 elite models, maybe somewhat in line with things like the Blade Guard Veterans or Space Marine Eradicators. In terms of points out of the box, the Einhir Hearthguard are fairly standout. If you just want a lot of points on the table for relatively low investment, then they seem like they might be one of the best options. As bigger and chunkier elite models, they get you around about 175 points, a pretty good ratio for newer models coming out of Games Workshop. That kind of points for the money invested tends to beat out most of their tank and vehicle offerings. When equipping them with the Hearthguard, I think I'll be most tempted by the Vulcanite weapons myself, though I think that you can make arguments for the plasma guns if you're on the board, and both of the melee weapons do seem pretty balanced to me. For the Hearthguard, I think I'd be most tempted to have a big unit of 10 teleporting off to douse the enemy in mortal wounds, and then hopefully have a relatively tough unit all ready for a charge as well if they do luck out and roll that 9. If you're looking at the Berserks, again I do think that the Mauls are generally better than the Blades at this point. They just do ridiculous damage to heavies and still have an okay amount of damage against light infantry. I would probably not bother with the Maul Grenade Launcher as it makes a weird massive base for the unit, and I would be kind of tempted to hide these in land fortresses or Sagittars if you did happen to have them around. Finally, for the Thunderkin, I feel like out of most of the Votann units, these guys are probably the most underwhelming unit in the codex right now. Still though, quite a lot of people do quite like their exo armor aesthetic and really quite cool big techie guns. I'd probably go for the graviton guns or the beam weapons. The bolt cannons just don't seem super standout for their cost. Finally, we've got the two Votann vehicles, the Sagittors and the Land Fortresses. My guess for these two is that they're both going to be really quite pricey indeed. I think it's unlikely that they charge less for the Sagittor than they do for things like the Space Marine Impulsor or the Sisters of Battle Immolator, and that would have it at around about £48, 63 euros or $80. Really quite a high price for the around 110 to 130 points that you get on the board for it. I feel like the vehicles for the Votann are probably going to be the biggest, most luxury options. If you want a cheaper force, then more of the foot guys is probably going to be better for you. Sagittors do seem pretty good in game though. I'd probably back up the bolt cannons either with just the cheap Matter auto cannon or maybe the Sagittor missiles or beams if I was feeling like upgrading. And I feel like their best use is probably just to deliver those berserks as opposed to Hearthkin, as they actually really need to get close and have spectacular damage when they do. Then of course we've got the big bad monster of the codex, the Land Fortress. I'm honestly a little bit unsure as to how much this one's going to cost, but I feel like something kind of similar to that new Space Marine Kratos tank certainly isn't out of the question. That would be £75, €100 or $125. That would get you around about 230 to 260 points worth of crazy powered tank on the board. Currently I feel like these are another one of the absolute massive standout units of the codex. Lots of general purpose firepower backed up by one big gun that can potentially shred tanks in a single shot, and potentially even entire squads of infantry if you do look out and roll the Judgment Token auto wounds. The conversion beam cannon also seems pretty useful as well. They can transport a unit, fairly fast and fairly long ranged, massively tough, and just overall seem very strong for 230 points worth of model. I feel like a bunch of people are going to pick these up, but I think if there's anything in the codex that is likely to get toned down in terms of points cost, then it might well be these guys. I'd say that if you are picking up one of these, I would just expect that it might well get nerfs in the future. I certainly wouldn't buy it and just assume that the rules are going to be just as powerful as they are all the way going forward. Finally, putting it together, here's just one idea for a 2000 point Votann army list built around the launch box and the combat patrol, and then just filling out with a fair few other units. This one's a bit of a fairly vehicle heavy one as it goes. From the HQs from the two boxes, we've got a Carl, a High Carl, and an Einherjar champion equipped with the hammer, and I've also chosen to add a Brockier Forge Master to that to help support some land fortresses. Then for the units, we've got 3 units of 10 Hearthkin warriors with Magna rail weapons, missile launchers and med packs, generally fairly hard-hitting squads that can't be ignored too much. 2 units of 5 Chthonian berserks with concussion maws, rallying 2 Sagittors that take the missile launchers, 2 units of Hernkin pioneers with the rotary cannon and the searchlight, and 2 land fortresses with the rail cannons, bolt cannons, and one of them takes beamers. That's all organised into a battalion and an outrider detachment. Probably not the most optimal thing ever. I feel like the extra HQs mean that you have to make some tough choices as to what sort of battalions you want. I feel like there's always room to optimise things a bit more from this point. In terms of the kits used, that's the army launch box, the combat patrol, and then 1 unit of berserks, 2 Sagittors, 2 land fortresses, and a Brockier Iron Master. Overall, that would all add up to being £520, 700 euros, or $870. Though admittedly, I do feel that this is probably doing Leagues of Votann the hard/expensive way. If you just wanted to get 2000 points worth of models on the table and you didn't really care about which ones too much, I think maybe something like an extra combat patrol might be the better way to go. And certainly swap out some of those vehicles for maybe some Einherjar Hearthguard, which get you far more points on the table per dollar than things like Sagittors or land fortresses. I think with that you could save yourself at least a good £100 or $200 or so. Anyway, just an idea for what a completed army could look like. I suspect that people might be building towards this in small chunks as and when, rather than going out and dropping loads of money on the entire army all at once. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion as to getting a Leagues of Votann force off the ground. Let me know what your thoughts are for when the range releases in full. Which of the previewed units would you be most likely to get and why? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. I'm sure we'll have a fair bit more coming out for the Leagues of Votann. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos, I would just like to mention the Patreon page and the channel giveaway once more. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to keep on making all these 40k videos like this quite so often, and I do run big giveaways like this every month, both with the options to enter on the Patreon or free on the Facebook page. Feel free to check out either of them down in the video description, particularly in the next few days after this video comes out, if you want to be in for the Votann boxes. Otherwise, channel patrons do get a fair few other advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.